Okay. Welcome back to Share the Load. Today I'm talking to my dear friend and colleague. Colleague
Mhm.
always sounds so old. Um, Brooks, her, who I will ask you to introduce yourself.
Sure. Yes, my name is Brooks. I've been bringing back actually my hyphenated last name, which I
Oh
had cut out.
yeah.
I know. Yeah. So Brooks Her Cardillo, which I shortened it a few years ago, and now I'm changing my mind. Um, and I didn't prepare an introduction, so this is going to be off the cuff. But yeah, I work at the intersection of spirituality and mental health. I'm an alumni of your Somatic Boundaries and Consent Educator Program, first cohort. I work with ritual and tarot, and I also am in school right now for mental health counseling. So I'm sort of incorporating that lens and hope to someday have like a therapy practice that integrates the spirituality work. And I also practice Reiki, and I also teach and do work around grief.
Mhm. Yes, which brings us to what's coming up and why you're here now. Which is that you're offering your grief class on grief and loss on the boundaries and consent journey, which I will say I took last year and it was
Mhm.
wonderful.
Thanks,
Um,
Mia.
yeah, it was a really supportive, yeah, really beautiful, beautiful course.
Thank you.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'm so excited to do it again. And like, there's some expansions this year too that I think they'll bringing like more of the spirituality piece in this year, which was sort of a request, I think, from the
Oh,
participants. Yeah, like us, like in class request slash also some like desire for more use of ritual and ceremony, which tracks. Like we did a lot
yeah.
of intellectual work around grief, but there was desire for like more group processing and more
Mm.
um yeah, more grief work in real time.
It's interesting because like a lot of people come into my educator program and have sort of a similar like related reaction but
Mm,
slightly different. Like the shape that it takes often is like the more they get into that work, the more they're like, uh-oh.
yeah.
Like I think I might have to believe in something larger than myself. Like that's not what I was
Yeah.
expecting when I
Yeah.
started this. Yeah, like you want the intellectual, you want the information, you
Hmm.
want the skills, the tools, the vocab, and like you get all that. But,
Right.
I think when you start really like deeply listening to what your body is telling you, it's like
Mm.
the, yeah, some kind of communication with like the unknown becomes kind of like a wall, where it's like if you're not willing to
Yeah.
go there, you're just going to be frozen at this wall. And like
Mm.
you can stay there,
Yeah.
but or you can keep going.
This is like you're immediately going to like the spiritual dimensions of what I brought to talk about today, of like this difference between, and you've talked about this with boundaries and consent work too a lot, that like initially there can be this desire for like a rule book
Yes.
or like a blame sheet, right? Of like,
Yes.
here's where I've been harmed and this is
Right.
why, and here's how I don't cause harm and this is why. And then like the deeper you get into the work, the more it gets really layered and really, yeah, really requires a certain degree of like faith and some really immense courage. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how that relates to OCD and my process with being someone who has OCD. But it really, you do just come up against that unknown
Yeah.
edge where, yeah, things, it requires a spiritual courage to go farther.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. And like a willingness to listen.
Mm,
Um,
mm-hmm.
because it is easy to like uh ignore a lot of the information that I think like in the courses that I teach, certainly you get really into the nitty gritty of like how this information is just oozing out of you at all times, like
Yeah.
no matter what. And
Yeah.
like, if you ignore, I mean, yeah, it gets harder and harder to ignore. It's like
Yeah.
once you learn that, like, prosody is a thing, for
Mm.
example, like
Mm-hmm.
prosody is the
Mm-hmm.
sound of what you say as opposed to the words that you're saying. So it's like your tone of voice and the volume and the pitch and the musicality of your speech. And it changes based on your emotional state. And just like knowing that there's like a word for that, I think
Yeah.
is incredible. And then it becomes something that you absolutely cannot ignore.
Mm. Yeah.
Or ignoring it takes a deeper level of like lying to yourself,
Mm. Yeah.
and
Yeah. Oof.
yeah, and like
Yes.
once you're just not willing to do that, you're like, fuck. Like, there's so
Yeah.
much information that I need to pay attention to.
Oh, yeah. I I've had I've been having so many really kind of, I'm like, friendship is really up for me right now. Like there's a lot of growing trying to happen in friendship. It relates, I mean, to
Mm-hmm.
all this. It's like a trying to show up in deeper authenticity and like um trying to like really grapple with power dynamics and like racialized dynamics in friendship. There's like a lot of things like up for me right now that feel like they're asking for kind of like a deep like a future self to like arrive stat,
Hmm.
and or like to work towards like the future self I want to be. But what you said about prosody, it's like I just I don't know, stuff too in there about like disorganized attachment and like feeling like I don't know, I can't trust my own signals right now with friendship, where I'm having
Mm-hmm.
like lots of really strange interactions that afterward I'm like, I don't even know if anything actually was wrong. And the other day I ran into someone and came home and I was like trying to excuse away all of the feelings about the prosody and the body language inside of the exchange. And I was like, oh no, that was ambivalence. Like what I'm feeling from that person is like a kind of fundamental level of ambivalence towards me that like
Mm.
I'm not actually comfortable with from friends. Like that doesn't feel like safe making for me.
Mm-hmm.
And it was such a moment where my body was just like trying to find every other explanation, or my nervous system, but like the texture of the interaction was in like subtle cues, and I was like, okay, we're gonna let that in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like stuff that once you see it, you can't really unsee it.
Yeah. Right. Which is not to say I know what was going on in that interaction or in that moment. Again, like the complexity and the unknowns of relating. But it was just more like, I was like, you don't have to hide from this feeling you're having. You could go towards it actually,
Mm-hmm.
and figure out what that's eliciting in me right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Unplanned non sequitur. Sorry about that.
I mean, that's what this is all about. It's a conversation.
Yeah.
I know you had a bunch of stuff planned to share, so do you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah. So what I would love for us to at least spend a good portion of the when I reached out to you to do this episode, um, I was like, I was revisited by something that I've wanted to talk about before, which is like the OCD and its relationship to boundaries and consent work. But
Mm-hmm.
this time I was really wanting to go into like OCD and grief,
Mm-hmm.
particularly like living the grief of living losses, meaning non-death losses. So I wanted to talk about the grief that comes up for me as someone living with OCD, who has OCD, and like also kind of even ponder together a little bit, like how I even am conceptualizing what OCD is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's like too many things for us to probably touch on inside of all of it, but we'll get to like a few of them and they'll be very rich, and that will be plenty.
Okay. I'm just playing with my cat's toes.
Yeah,
Sorry.
do it.
She's like stretching them at me. They're very cute. Okay, great.
Yeah. So maybe like important context to start with is just that you are the person who first suggested to me that that I might have OCD. And it's such an important, I think, like also such an important turning point in my life.
Whoa.
And yeah, enormous. Because OCD is such a specific experience. And so for people who don't really know that much about it, I'll be brief with like the dry part of it, but it begets like a definition. I haven't quite figured out for myself whether I categorize OCD as a disability, a form of neurodivergence. Those would overlap, right? It's in the DSM-5. It's like considered, in the realm of like a mental disorder. Disorders in the name, obsessive compulsive disorder. But basically, it's like a highly heterogeneous, very diverse way that it manifests for people. Like a neurological experience where I used to try to come up with different names for it. And like one of them was like a persistent, what was it? Like a persistent and detail-oriented focus. And it's incredibly disabling. It's like considered one of the top 10 most disabling conditions that you can have, actually. And it isn't always disabling, and there's not necessarily for everyone like the same course. So some of us, we have like spike of it in a certain time in our life, and then it's not that intense. For some of us, it comes and it goes. But it is so recent that OCD has even been understood by the psychology community, that like in the 1970s, late 1970s, it was still considered like degenerative and uncurable condition where like if it got bad enough, your options were to be hospitalized for the duration of your life or be like self-manage. And so it like I think it's wild that it's just this, I just think the history of it and sort of the context of that is wild. But yeah, and it doesn't look the way that it's stereotypically presented. It doesn't necessarily cluster around cleanliness or hand washing or like external rituals. The components of OCD, as far as we know, are like kind of these internal thoughts, like intrusive or repetitious thoughts, themes that feel scary or anxiety producing. And then the like compulsion to try to suppress the thoughts is sort of the current understanding of it. And the compulsion can be external, like the thought is like, I've left the burners on. This is one of my real ones. And the compulsion would be like, I have to turn around and check. Just so that I can suppress the intensity of like the fear and the inner experience. But there's also things like that are more where the compulsion is more an internal experience. Like I wrote a paper yesterday and got my grade back today, and I was like, I should just read the paper again. There's nothing even like, I'm not even really sure what itch I'm scratching there, but it's like, I'm just gonna one more time.
Right. The turning the burner off one, I've created a rule for myself. I think it's important for me to share. Like the reason why I brought up OCD with you was because I was looking into having it myself. And I certainly have a lot of traits that fall under that umbrella, including dermatillomania, like skin picking and chewing. I'm often worried that I left the oven on. And so I created a rule or like a ritual, I guess, for myself where every time I turn the oven off, I have to say out loud, I turned the oven off. Because that, like, I can remember that I did that a lot better than I can remember if I turned the knob.
Right. Oh, yeah. Well, and it's such a balance with OCD of like this just raises, I guess, something else about it that often people don't know. And this is why I feel like it was such a turning point in my life when you told me maybe you should look into this. Is that I always think about, I'm going to do a hand gesture and I'll describe it, but like, I think the way I understand my OCD gets worse when like, if I walk in the direction of the impulse to control, right? If I walk in the direction of the compulsion, my life gets narrower and narrower, and I just have my hands by my face and they're like angling in towards, the screen. And the more I go towards that, like, I just need to check the burners one more time. Actually, the worse my OCD symptoms will get. And then when checking once worked yesterday, checking 4 times might be like, the next one. And then leaving the house gets hard. And so it's like, and I actually am using, like, of my OCD symptoms, I'm using the most like concrete and visible one, because most of them exist internally for me. But so, like, the thing about knowing that I have OCD is when I catch like a whiff of that, like, oh, well, I'll just do this and then I will know that I didn't cause harm. I actually have to turn around and like walk in the other direction where the hallway is widening, and I'm like walking in the direction of, like, I might have caused harm with that email. I'm not going to reread it right now. And I really vacillate in terms of like what I think about the current idea that OCD treatment is all exposure. Like, I think that contemporary treatment is like a lot more compassionate than every time.
Yeah.
You have to do the hardest thing. But in general, the trajectory is like you have to kind of walk in this expanding direction where there's like a lot of confrontation of worst fears, or like possibly kind of like dropping the ball or missing a cue, or
that's making me think of so many things. I mean, one in particular is like this thing that I now teach. I now start all my classes with this class that's basically like, what is consent and what is it not, so that we're defining it up front. And one of the things that it's not is something you can ever do perfectly. And I think there's a lot of people who hear that and go, oh no, like, what do you mean? Why else am I here?
Yeah.
And then there's a lot of other people, and sometimes that first group like converts pretty quickly into this other group where it's like actually incredibly relieving, because it's like, oh, I don't have to have this like chokehold on everything I say and do, because I'm never going to get it perfect. Like that can bring a lot of relief. So yeah, like that comes to mind. And then I'm also thinking about, I've written pretty extensively on like when consent gets used as a weapon of control, where like when some people start to like, you brought this up, this like blame rule book or whatever. And it's like, if I leave an interaction feeling icky, I might, and I'm saying really I, like me specifically with like my brain, I might comb through everything that was said to find the thing that the other person did that made me feel icky. So that I can point the finger of blame away from myself. And the much more sort of true thing is that, like, I think most of the time in those instances, nobody is to blame. There is no blame. There's just some icky feelings. Perhaps there's like a boundary I didn't know I had, or like something that I didn't make clear, or we misunderstood each other or whatever, or an incompatibility that's been uncovered. But if I continue down that road, I will turn this beautiful thing that is consent into a way to just like blame other people for anything, any bad feeling that I have. The other thing that I wanted to say before I pass it back to you is that one of the things that you're talking about sounds to me like boundaries with yourself. I am not going to reread that email. I'm not going to reread that essay right now. I am not going to check my email past 8 p.m. And like, unfortunately, there's a lot of stuff in our lives currently that like reward us, at least with dopamine, for giving into that impulse. We've got this like chime sound when an email comes in. We've got the hearts and the likes and the numbers and the ding, ding, dings and the notifications and the blue light on the phone and,
Yeah.
and I think, all of this is circling around these ideas that I talk about so much on here around like, you know, cancellation as like control tactics to get other people to do things that you want to do your way. And like, especially the way that I've found in a lot of the circles that I find myself in, there's this like, there's at least a few people who think that their way of doing things is the one right way to do things. And for someone like me, who, may or may not have some degree of OCD, I haven't been like officially diagnosed, which is like why I say that, but it's very appealing. It's like, oh, you're just going to tell me how to do things right. Like, that's really enticing.
Right. Yeah. Right. Well, and it's like, it's so, I don't know, it's interesting because like there's many things in what you just said that just kind of feel generative to me, or get me thinking. There's like a part of me that always gets stiff when we like I like get a little bit like formal and like a weird like version of myself when we get on the podcast. And I was noticing it when I was like, it's weird to speak to so many people who aren't in the room with us right now. But there's this thing that happens, and I don't quite know how that fits into this other piece of it, but like there's this thing that happens sometimes when we're talking about grief or we're talking about like OCD. This all came up around the idea of like, it's like having boundaries with myself, where like I want to keep it really dimensional, and I want to keep it really, I want to be as like authentic as I can be in this moment about where I'm at in my understanding of this experience that I have been handed. This is me authentically like stumbling, but I'm okay and I'm into it because like what I'm trying to do is like get under the wellness speak of like, I just need to have like this is all about, and this didn't feel like what you were saying, but I felt myself go to a place where I was like, I can be an authority of this work and be like, this is about boundaries with myself. But where my mind went when you said that was like, last semester for school, I did a presentation on OCD for my diagnosis and treatment class, basically because I didn't want someone else to botch it. I was like, I can't sit there and listen to someone else just not actually give any like go to the stereotypical place, or like I really did feel resentful of some of the representations of OCD that are out there. And I feel that way about a lot of things in the psychology field. But so I was like, I just need to like, I want to do this. I care about this. I care about people having this experience. But I knew I was also going to like spike my OCD because I care so much about it. So I said, I'm going to record this presentation once. That's one and done. We're going to do it. Boundary. 7th round, I'm re-recording it. I'm crying because I can't stop. And I was like, if this isn't meta, I don't know what is. If like I'm not having like an absolute, I know what's happening to me. I understand that this is like, that my feeling that I need to re-record it is not entirely, I don't even know what to call that. Like, I like, no, it's not totally trustworthy, I guess. I even like understand and finally like wish well for myself. That was a big part of the OCD journey, was realizing that I'm not evil at the core. And then I like, it's okay that I'm here on the earth. And I'm finally there where like, I really don't want myself to re-record a presentation 7 times. And that was not the last time. There were more. I had to cry and then I had to pull it together.
This is, for some reason, it feels like there's like a part of you that's saying no, and there's another part of your OCD won't respect your no.
Yeah, right.
Like,
and it
doesn't take no well.
Well, and this is where at times it's been really helpful for me to like kind of try to understand it from a more of a physiological standpoint. And this is where like I did some journaling before we met, and I was like, what do I even think OCD is? Let's see if I can find that section. And I was like, you know, I can't find the section, and that's fine. It's like, is this a disability? Is this mental illness? Is this neurodivergence? Is this a repository of unaddressed harm from my ancestors? Is it a spiritual challenge that I agreed to take on when I incarnated? Is it my teacher? Is it a gift? I don't really know what to make of it. And so like when you say it's like your OCD is not letting you, in that image of holding my own boundaries, part of a boundary I have with myself and OCD is that I don't belittle anymore how hard it is for me to do certain things. I used to feel like a failure, like a personal failure. And you saw me in the most closed up I've ever been, where when I first taught, I almost said to the podcast listeners, like, guys, if you could have seen me when like addressing them directly.
You can, they're there.
You know, when Mia first asked me to teach on grief in the educator training, they had to coach me so deep. I mean, I was freaking out, you know, and I had to read from a script because I could not be in a room full of people. So importantly, I have like the way my OCD manifests, or the subcategory of it, is harm OCDs, fear of causing harm or fear of being harmed. And that looks like a million different ways. But in this case, it shows up a lot around visibility and teaching, like afraid I'll do something really harmful and really terrible by accident or unknowingly. And so, yeah, teaching was just like, I mean, you saw me in the moments when I almost couldn't stop shaking, you know, and that was waking up to falling asleep. I don't remember why I got there, but a boundary is like, I don't belittle anymore, like how hard it is for me to do certain things. I think back to that time, and I think back to like the period where I couldn't drive anymore, or couldn't leave the house anymore. And I feel like a lot of reverence and compassion for that. This is not the experience everyone else is having of leaving the house or doing a Zoom call or like introducing themselves in their first day of classes, or you know, whatever the thing, or re-recording a presentation. So there's like this balance between just like, I don't know, maybe I'll pause there and just pass it back.
Well, I'm remembering like, you know, I think there's like, I just wrote a piece on Substack last week about how like you've made people uncomfortable and they haven't told you. And this is like something that I've posted about a lot on Instagram, but I go more in depth in the post. And it's like, you know, why, like if I ask anybody, you know, every time you've ever been uncomfortable, have you told the person? The answer is never yes. You know, it's always no,
right.
Not every time.
Right.
And so then we turn that logic back on ourselves. Like, why do we think we're the exception? That I've not told everybody who's made me uncomfortable that they've made me uncomfortable.
Right.
Why would I think that I've never made anyone uncomfortable, or every time I have, they've told me?
Right. Yeah.
And, you know, people have come to me and like scheduled sessions with me, or violated my boundaries by calling me on the phone when they're like not a client, and you know, they like found my email signature somewhere that had a phone number in it, and said like, I don't ever want to make anyone do anything they aren't comfortable with.
Right.
And I'm like, you can't.
Yeah.
You actually can't, guarantee.
Right.
And, or, you know, like more recently, there was someone who it takes the form, it comes in many shapes, but it's essentially the same sentiment. How do I make sure that no one is ever mad at me? How do I make sure nobody ever hates me? And you can't.
Yeah.
You know, like you just, and I was just talking with Risden on the phone before we started this podcast. Risden is my co-host on you're doing it wrong. We were talking about how, because another friend of mine asked me this morning, like, are there just people out there who are like looking for things to get mad about?
Mm-hmm.
And, I talked to Risen about this and she was like, yes, yes, there
Mm-hmm.
are.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just that. It's like there's some when anyone is like stuck in a really serious victim mindset, and I want to be clear, like I want to distinguish a victim mindset from like, instances in which you are or were a victim. Like that's a different thing. Um, but like a victim mindset where it's like there's always someone to blame, as opposed to maybe there is simply no blame. And then beyond that, looking for like a villain, you know. Um, and so that is definitely a real thing. And then there is also like truly something akin to addiction to like stress and anger, like I think that's what a lot of doom scrolling is. It's like you're not looking for to smile or like cry happy tears or laugh, you're looking for like what else is going to piss me off and piss me off and piss me off. And I think, it gives you like that cortisol or whatever. Anyway, I can relate to that through what I experience as OCD, that like the way that manifests for me a lot of the time is like, I'm feeling stressed. So I start chewing my lip, which makes me feel more stressed. And then it makes me feel embarrassed that I can't stop. And I know I'm going to regret it, but I keep doing it. And then my brain starts looking for other things to get stressed about, or I am stressed about something like with my partner, let's say, and then we talk and it's fine. Like we figure it out and it's fine. Or it was like a misunderstanding and it's no big deal. And I'm like, oh, I was upset about nothing. But I'm still like craving whatever those hormones or chemicals are. So I look for other shit to get upset about. Like I can very much relate to that. And so I think, there's like, when that goes rampant, when that gets out of control, it does often look like people trying to control other people, trying to tear other people down, and look for all the ways that other people are doing things horribly wrong. But anyway, I got kind of sidetracked. The point I was trying to make was that like you can't make everybody like you, and you can't make sure that no one's ever mad at you, and you can't make sure that you never make anyone uncomfortable. So like instead of, the approach that I find works so much better is like that those thoughts definitely like give me an ouchie, like I'm like, that's I really don't like that. But like learning to live with that or like move through that, it's not constant, is so much better and helps preserve my connections with other people. It helps expand my patience. It helps me have better relationships. Expanding, being able to move through that discomfort rather than what feels like it would be safer, but ultimately isn't, which is like having that chokehold on every time I want to express myself. I have to make sure that I'm doing it correctly, in air quotes.
There's something in here. Well, a couple things. I mean, one, like having an ability to recognize. I'm just gonna actually my phone, there's a Signal working group that's going a lot. So sorry about that. Having a relationship to grief and being able to like spot and understand it. Like when you were describing that feeling of like, I just need to look for something else to be angry about. I've been doing a lot of organizing at school around solidarity with Palestine and trying to push the school culture to stop. There's like so many instances of like really unchecked racism bias happening in a program that like professes to be social justice focused program.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of like righteous rage in me and in my like co-organizers. But I keep having these moments where I'm in the thick of like rereading some email that's rife with microaggressive statements. And I'm like, do I want to be like how much of this moment is righteousness? Really, and like, is much of this serving me? I don't know. I'm having like a minute where it's feeling very fruitful when I notice that tone of like,
Mm,
I feel, and I think what's coming up for me as you describe this is like a lot of my harm OCD themes are around, they attach to my values. So it's like,
mm,
I'm afraid I've done something terrible, but part of why I'm afraid of that is not just fear of being canceled. It's like really deep commitment to a level of like collective healing
mhm.
um, around so many things. But I think like systems of oppression and how and when I participate in them,
Mhm.
whether I'm on the receiving end, of the oppressive force, or I'm perpetuating it. But like there have been moments where I'm like, it's not, this concern isn't wrong. It's attaching to a really important value that I have. And the like what you're talking about made me think about like being in a practice with that value is really healthy, I think, and
Yeah.
really uh, dynamic and really deep. And in that moment when I'm like reading this email from some other who I'm really angry at, and the anger is reasonable, it's
Yeah.
valid, but like I also feel this like flickering opportunity for me to be like, you could stay there and you'd be really morally protected. You'd be like, in the right.
Yeah.
Or you could like come in a little closer to like what is just past the righteousness you're feeling. That is like my work to do inside of all of this. And I don't know if
Yeah.
I'm explaining that very well, but that's where grief work feels like it comes in. I'm like, oh, I'm
Mm,
angry, but I'm also so much grief under there that I don't
yeah.
want to touch. I don't want to do it. I'd rather just be mad.
Right. Right. Yeah. I had this thought the other day of like, if I, and it's in a post queued to come up to like also for your class, but
Great.
yeah, where like if I have the thought, well, fuck you too, then
Uh-huh.
I'm probably avoiding some grief.
Hmm. Yeah. Right. And there's actually a way to do the well, fuck you too, then that is grieving. Like, I don't know, the other day, like to draw it back in a little, or I guess where that image sent me was like actually a moment with myself. I don't know if it's exactly this, but um, the other day I was having an OCD spike. And I don't remember if I've said this now, like why I wanted to talk about OCD and grief, and maybe we could go to those like graphics that I showed you a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm having a moment now where I've made it a long way out of the like a pretty intense a very intense mental health crisis before I realized I had OCD. But it's still day to day incredibly disabling. And so I've kind of like reached the end of the benefit of just knowing what I'm working with. And there's like a
Mm-hmm.
need for other tools or different, like, I'm not quite sure uh, what needs to happen next for me to kind of like continue to wield this in a way that I can live my life fully and connect fully and all of that. But like at this crossroads where I'm like, damn, I'm still having days like this is so much grief. And so I was in the car the other day and I was having symptom spike, and it was very much like that image of the presentation re-recording over and over and being like, I know this is OCD right now, but I can't get out of it. And I was just crying and having this like really intense urge to be like witnessed in that moment. It's like having a fantasy of calling my family and being like, this is what it's like on a hard day. Like, I don't think you know. Why did I bring this up? You said something.
Fuck
Oh,
you
well,
too
fuck you
then.
too then.
Yeah.
And I think like all there was to do in that moment, like the fantasy of like, I need to call people, they need to know that I want this to be known, right? Like, I really want to be seen and how hard this has been. And I was like, because why? And then it just was like, because it's fucking hard. Like, I just was like, all I actually needed to do was kind of have the, well, fuck you too then moment, but like a little bit more tenderized. Like, that is how I'm feeling. I'm angry, I'm frustrated. And like, you know, from taking my classes that I don't think of grief as a single emotion, but as like, it has a range of emotions. So anger is definitely in there of like a way we can feel grief. But there's like I don't know, it maybe is like similar to Resmaa Menakem's idea of clean pain or dirty pain. Like, there's a way to be in anger that is avoidant, and there's a way to be in anger that is like really connected to the grief.
Yeah. I'm feeling very pulled to talk about what I said I was going to talk about.
Go for it.
Okay. In June, I got a call from my then book agent, who has since dropped me, saying that my editor at the publishing house I was working with on my book for years had received an email with some strange things in it. And I say strange because they're like things that you would not think would have any bearing on like not only whether or not anyone should write a book, but like the specifics of like what my book was about. It was just sort of like weird stuff that I was like, what? So what? You know? But that they were canceling my book deal. And we were like 2 months away from publication. And we'd been talking about like book cover designs the week before. And just hearing what you're saying about anger, you know, I'm finally able to talk about this because I've gotten my rights back. And I'm publishing the book on Substack tomorrow. This podcast will probably come out tomorrow, but so it'll be out by then, or it'll be up on Substack by then. But you know, there's a way that like I remember, so 4 or 5 days after my book deal got officially canceled, my cousin died. And I ended up in like an anxiety spike where I like didn't recognize myself. Like, I was acting and saying things that I just was like, this is not based in anything that I like know or believe or like really want or feel, you know? And I am so quick to go into like fix it mode and strategizing. You know, it took just a couple days before I thought of publishing it on Substack, and I got very excited about that idea. And I was like, cool, yeah, like I'm over it, no problem. I have a better way to go anyway. And like, fuck those people, you know, they don't deserve the book. And I mean, I maintain that. I do believe that. I think if you can't stand behind an author because they're seen as a somewhat, you know, controversial figure in their field, like, then you're kind of missing the point, personally. But, you know, I noticed myself like avoiding the feelings of grief that would let me like move through it by favoring these ones that sort of tickled my like, or, you know, scratched my like productivity itch. Like, at least I'm doing something if I'm planning or figuring it out or fixing it. And, you know, now several months later, like, I have prepared the announcement. It's all set up to go out tomorrow morning. And, you know, I woke up really anxious today. I got on this call with you and was like, I'm feeling a lot of anxiety and I'm feeling a lot of fear. And a lot of it is around like visibility and like, am I asking for like more wrath? You know, am
Mhm.
I like painting a target on my back?
Mhm.
And like in certain ways I am, but there's just, I think, a lot that gets stuck in avoiding the the feelings associated with grief. Like
Yeah.
it just
Yeah.
becomes um yeah, I mean, I wonder about a relationship between like engaging in the grieving process and like how PTSD sets in or something like that.
Mhm.
Because I have to imagine that it certainly feels like
Mm.
if I avoid the grief, then I end up with like some PTSD. And you know,
Mhm.
I think
Mhm.
from a
Mhm.
trauma like that, it's like entirely reasonable to end up with some kind of PTSD, you know,
Mhm.
like just the fear of putting myself out there and the fear of like embarking on a project as big as that,
Right.
only to have it like torn away. And
Yeah.
um you know, it makes me wonder like who I can trust and
Yeah.
doubt my judgment, like all these things that come along with it. And but yeah, it just it I'm suddenly wondering like I wonder how much you can do in the grieving process that like supports you in healing so that you don't end up with PTSD.
Yeah. It's a good question. I mean, this is like a place where my lenses like sort of crash against each other in a way that I like, where it's
Mm,
like, I'm like, I mean, from like a spirituality lens and the work I've done, the like learning I've done from teachers in terms of grief and spirituality, yeah, it's monumental. It's like about,
yeah.
that we've talked about this a lot, but like grieving the dead helps them transition,
Mm,
that's like, it's not just for the living, it's also to support the spirit moving on. And when I think about that, and I teach about this in any of my grief classes, bless you, um, that that like there is sort of a way that even me reaching out to you and being like, I want to do this podcast because I feel like something's ready to be witnessed at the moment about like how hard this has been and continues to be.
mm,
I'm doing that because what I'm hoping, I can tell I need that witness, and with PTSD and trauma, at least some of like the idea around what distinguishes a traumatic event from like being a traumatic event that gets integrated versus a traumatic event that becomes post-traumatic stress disorder
mhm,
is someone there to validate
mm,
what happened and help complete the stress cycle. That is at least a major part of not having this like these lingering pieces. I don't think that's the whole picture necessarily, but so from like a spirituality standpoint too, with grieving, I don't know, when you were describing that experience, I was like, how much time have you spent with how you feel about the fact that somebody hurt you? That's the
oh
grief
yeah.
part.
I mean, and it's not just that somebody hurt me, and it's not even just one person. Um,
Right, right.
and it's like that there, I mean, there is one person, there is one person, and I know who that person is, who like not just hurt me, but like wants to hurt me.
Yeah,
And
right,
like, yeah,
right,
wants and consciously like
right,
wants to ruin me.
right. And
And
from the grief perspective, right, like this is like, what is the spiritual impact
yeah.
of that feeling? And then that's yours to grapple with in this lifetime, right? Where it's like, it's intense, but it's like, like I'm dealing with in these friendship things where I'm like coming up against this constant feeling of non-belonging, and it feels a little like the call is coming from inside the house,
Right,
and I'm
right.
like, okay, well, so this is, this brings up really big spiritual questions, particularly I do, when there is an interaction with someone else's real personhood, like for you in this moment, I'm just thinking about what might be left to do, right? That
Mm-hmm.
like comes up in that anxiety today
Right.
is like, people can hurt me. I'm visible out there. And that means that if people wanted to
Yeah.
do, cause harm, they could.
Well, I mean, it also like brings me back to like what we were talking about earlier, which is like, and I think interestingly also how OCD, it sounds like, manifests for you and can for a lot of people, where it's like I really, just the idea that like someone hates me, or
Mm-hmm.
like that
Right.
someone
Right.
um feels so harmed by me,
Mm-hmm. Right.
obviously,
Right. 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 Yeah.
um and I talked to like a colleague recently who like runs a small business that like makes very little money, and it's like hard to keep the whole thing afloat, and he had a similar experience, and he was like, it seems like if you like run a business or really like put yourself out there in any like meaningful way, um there's going to be people who hate you.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like there's, it's one thing to like learn to live with that reality like on its own. It's
Mm-hmm.
another thing to live with the reality or the likely possibility that like those very people could have like real impact on your
Mm-hmm.
livelihood and your well-being, on your relationships. I mean, I had a friend who like didn't talk to me for a long time because
Mm-hmm.
of this person, and then came back into my life and apologized, and um we're very close again now, thank goodness. But um yeah, just like learning to let go of what I can't control is feels so much um like more in line with my values
Mm-hmm.
than what I could see as like an equally, low hanging um reaction available to me, which would be to like
Right.
try to control a
Right.
bunch of other people and how they perceive me.
Right. Yeah. Right. Like, I guess there's a part of me that just wants to, I'm of two minds right now. And I'm aware of the time too, that like we're probably nearing the end a little bit. But I guess with like okay, I'll bring it back to boundaries and consent work. And I'm sure this will relate to OCD. I'm not quite sure how yet, but that's fine because it feels important that like, I guess I just don't find it helpful. I haven't experienced something like you have with this book deal. And in fact, I have mostly, I'm sure there are a bunch of people who don't like me on the internet, but they have not, like, I don't, made themselves known for the most
Right.
part. And we have very different platform size and all of that. But I think like even in that kind of caricature of somebody who has a victim mindset, or like I like tend to want, I just don't think I can conceptualize of like the human experience in these like simplified caricatures. And I don't know when that started to take hold. Like, I don't think that's an always true, but I think, oh, here's how it relates to OCD. Cool. I think grappling with kind of what you're talking about of like, I think grappling with my own anxieties about harm OCD. And I've had some very intense harm OCD themes. Like, they're too scary and too personal to share in, like, out of kindness for myself. Like, I'm not going to make myself share them, but there was like, but like, one like very, can I do this without sharing them? Let me think about it. I think having periods of time where I've been afraid, because part of harm OCD is being afraid you've caused harm and don't remember it, or caused harm and didn't know it, right? There's like It's not a logical, I can remember this happened or that harm has happened to you. So I had a lot of OCD themes around sexual assault, experiencing it, enacting it. I had a whole period of time where I was like, I don't know where all this sexual trauma is coming from. I don't know if something happened to me or didn't. I didn't know I had OCD, had no way to make sense of the imagery and the inner experience. And so in some ways I had to like kind of go into a place where I was like, what do I make of this human phenomenon that like people do this to each other? I might have done this. I'm afraid this happened to me. Like there was so much in there. And I think having many things like that, that's not the only time a theme has gripped me and taken me into this place where we're going is like the places that I think as a society and a culture, we don't handle well. Or that where we like decide that people are unretrievable. Like OCD loves to live in those places. Let me just make you think you did something that would make you, irrevocably bad. And that creates like a certain kind of spiritual quality of like, I think it's just changed how I look at people and their behavior, where like I'm always just kind of wondering what's going on for that person and feeling like if our lives are touching, like there's some kind of way that like my stuff and their stuff that we came in to work on is like linked and important. And it's easier to say that in the abstract than when it's happening and it hurts. But I do feel like I don't even know really what I feel like that touches some of like the spiritual elements of grief, which like where grief tends to touch us on the spiritual and existential is like loss of meaning, loss of joy or hope. It's like existential loneliness feeling, like questions about the nature of love and trust, anger with God, anger with the universe, anger with the earth, anger with ourselves, feeling isolated or bitter or alone on like such a fundamental level. I don't know how to tie that up, Mia, but I think we can't leave people there. Gotta like bring us out of that. But I do think there's like benefit to grappling with those feelings when they come up. It's like you said about prosody. I could pretend that when I had that interaction earlier this week with a friend, that it was like, this shallow, like shoulder deep. But actually what it touches is like the very bottom of my stomach pit feeling that actually I'm bad and everyone is going to figure that out and to know it. And that I don't deserve love. So like if I don't pretend that away, I can actually work with it. And I think a lot of that is grief work.
Yeah, I mean that list that you just read really, really hit hard for me. I think wanting to like disappear and not be seen or witnessed or known was like really on my mind for a few weeks. But yeah, I'm really grateful for like that I got to take your class last year, because I think similar to like what I said about prosody, that like once you name it, you can't really ignore it. I feel that way about grief now.
Right.
Where it's like if I can go, oh, that's grief.
Yeah, right.
Then I can like pull out my grief toolkit. I know how to tend to it. I know that it's something that probably needs to be mourned. And I think one of the beautiful things about your class is that it offers like a community space to do that with like other people who are invested in that same kind of work. I feel so lucky these days to have like such a beautiful spiritual community in LA at my synagogue. And I go to every Shabbat service and I say the Kaddish for my cousin. And, that's a really beautiful ritual to engage in because every week it's different, and some weeks I'm like, wow, I'm like making progress. Like I don't feel as just, dark and in despair as I did last time I said this prayer.
Right.
And then the next time I say it, I'm like, oh my God, I am hopeless,
Yeah, right.
It's not always linear, but I think with these non-death losses, it's like you don't necessarily have, like where do I go and who do I commune with to like process the death of like a creative project of like that
Right.
scope,
Right. Yeah.
I think there's also like some fears that I have around being like, oh no, like you lost your book deal. Like that's like, but that's amazing that you even had a book deal. Like, how could you complain about, I don't know, whatever. But that's like projection or
like if you tried to grieve, it would be.
Yeah, that I'm like unaware of the privilege that I had that like in the first place I had a book deal at all.
Right.
Or that's like in terms of the problems that a person could have, like that's like a pretty elitist problem or something like that, like just prejudging myself or whatever. But yeah, I mean, I think your class really offers a beautiful space for people to go and process and consider their grief around a lot of types of losses that like don't otherwise have designated spaces.
Right. Yeah. Well, and the longer I do this work, and it tracks with like also coming out of this like deep isolation space that I was in the winter of 2021. Like, when I started doing grief work, I was like, oh, I'll just do it myself. I'll just do it by myself in the dark. And that worked for the time. It was like, I didn't feel able. I wasn't at that time able to like share it. I mean, I think that what you said about feeling nervous about ridicule, I mean, there's a lot of layers to it and things to consider always about like where we center ourselves. But do you think grief needs a space where we trust that people can hold our sadness? And I don't think that's a zero sum, or that like when it's sort of placed in that. Anyway, what I was going to say is that the more I do this work, the more I'm like coming back around to the realization that I can't do it actually alone, that like when I reach a point with the grief where like what it needs is someone else to be there to hear what has happened. One of the mental, like, so in the class, we'll break down like how grief is landing in you. And these aren't like hard lines, but there's like emotional and mood and mental and kind of like thought-based experiences of grief, and physiological, like loss of sleep, loss of appetite, energy fluctuations, and then like daily life and spiritual elements. But like one of the mental processes that happens in grief is a need to repetitively tell the story over and over. And I learned this from Megan Devine around like particularly with like tragic deaths. There can be this like I need to say again that this happened. But I also think that need to tell the story comes up a lot around these like losses that could be easily minimized or aren't totally understood as losses. And that's me in the car being like, I gotta call my family right totally. Now, and there is something happening in the body when we do that, like you were saying about the ritual of going to synagogue. So like, yeah, and there's just got to be someone else there to tell the story. You can't just tell it to myself over and over. So I think the class also offers a space. The class, and I am plugging it, but like also we can do this for each other in the everyday as well.
Yeah.
It's where your friends and loved ones can come in.
Yeah. Okay, well, so how can people find out more about this class and sign up?
People can find out more about this class on your Instagram, on my Instagram. Veils.veils.veils is my handle. People can sign up on the Consent Wizardry website. And I'm trying to think like if there are if there's anything else I need to say about that, or like if you have questions, or my brain is just in the deep and I'm like having trouble coming back to logistics. But all the info is on your website, including sliding scale and payment plans and all of that, to make it as accessible as we can to folks.
Great. And that's
Mhm.
consentwizardry.com. And my Instagram is at consent.wizardry.
Yep.
All right. Well, thanks, Brooke.
Thanks, Mia.
Hmm.